In 238 AD, Roman Emperor Maximus Thrax was dragged naked through the streets of Aquileia, his crown replaced with a rope around his neck. But that's not even the worst part. What if I told you that some of history's most powerful kings died more shamefully than common criminals? Imagine ruling millions, commanding armies, being worshipped as a god, only to have your final moments become the stuff of nightmares. By the end of this video, you'll understand why historians tried to bury these stories for centuries. We're talking about 3 execution methods so brutal, so humiliating, that they redefined what it meant to fall from power. First, you'll witness a Roman emperor literally fed to starved wild beasts by his own palace guards while thousands cheered. Then I'll reveal how an English king was murdered with a red-hot poker in the most intimate and agonizing way possible, designed to leave no external marks. And finally, the most disturbing of all, a Chinese emperor slowly boiled alive in his own cooking pot for 3 excruciating hours. If you're fascinated by history's darkest secrets, hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't believe what happens to ruler number 2. Trust me, once you see how these so-called divine monarchs really died, you'll never look at power the same way again. But here's what nobody tells you about these executions. These weren't random acts of violence. In the ancient world, how you killed a king sent a message that echoed through history itself. See, for thousands of years, monarchs claimed divine right, the idea that God himself chose them to rule. They lived in golden palaces, wore crowns worth more than entire cities, and commanded absolute obedience from millions of subjects. The very thought of touching a king was punishable by death. But here's the twisted irony. When these god kings finally fell, their executioners didn't just want them dead. They wanted to strip away every last shred of dignity, to prove that underneath all that divine authority was just fragile, screaming human flesh. Each execution method was carefully chosen, psychological warfare. Feeding an emperor to beasts, it reduced him to mere meat. The red-hot poker, it targeted the most private, vulnerable part of the human body. Boiling alive, it turned the ruler into a helpless, suffering spectacle. These weren't crimes of passion. They were calculated humiliations designed to destroy not just the king, but the very concept of royal invincibility. The executioners understood something crucial. If you're going to kill a god king, you better make sure everyone knows he bleeds just like everyone else. But here's what history books won't tell you about how these gods among men really died. The details are so disturbing that medieval chroniclers often wrote them in code, and modern historians still debate whether to include them in textbooks. What you're about to hear comes from eyewitness accounts, official court records, and the private diaries of those who watched these executions unfold. Some of this footage might be hard to watch, but understanding how power really works means confronting the brutal reality of how it ends. Are you ready to see behind the crown? Let's start with an emperor who thought he was untouchable. Picture this. It's April 238 AD, and Emperor Maximus Thrax is barricaded inside his own tent, listening to his army sharpen their swords outside. This 8-foot-tall giant had terrorized Rome for 3 years, executing senators for sport and taxing citizens into starvation. But here's what nobody tells you. His soldiers didn't just want him dead, they wanted him humiliated. According to contemporary historian Herodotus's eyewitness account, the Praetorian guards burst into Maximus's tent at dawn. The emperor, who had ordered thousands of crucifixions, was now crawling on his knees begging for mercy from his own men. They dragged him to the amphitheater in Aquileia, stripped him completely naked, and threw him into the arena. But this wasn't a quick death. Oh no. The guards had been starving a pack of North African lions for 3 days, specifically for this moment. Imagine you're in that crowd of 10,000 Romans. The man who claimed Jupiter himself had chosen him to rule is now running naked around the sand, desperately trying to climb the arena walls while massive lions stalk him from behind. Herodotus writes that Maximus lasted exactly 17 minutes before the first lion caught him. But here's the most twisted part. They didn't kill him quickly. The lions had been trained for the games. They knew how to make it last. The crowd counted each bite. First, they took his legs, then his arms. The emperor, who had never shown mercy, was now experiencing exactly what he'd subjected thousands of others to, only worse, because everyone knew who he was. Contemporary accounts describe how Maximus kept screaming, "I am your emperor," even as the beast tore into him. The crowd's response? Thunderous laughter. 3 years of brutal oppression were being paid back in the most public, humiliating way possible. When it was finally over, the guards threw his remains to wild dogs outside the city walls. No burial, no funeral rites, no monument. The man who built temples to himself became literal dog food. But wait until you see what they did to the next king's body after he died. Because what happened to Edward II of England makes being eaten by lions look like mercy. The method his executioners chose was so intimate, so precisely cruel, that it took royal torture to an entirely new level of psychological warfare. Don't click away yet, because this next execution method was designed to leave zero evidence while maximizing suffering. September 21st, 1327, Berkeley Castle, England. King Edward III sits chained in a dungeon cell. But his executioners face a deadly problem. They need him dead without a mark on his body. See, Edward's wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, had orchestrated this assassination, but they needed it to look natural. A king covered in wounds would raise too many questions. So they devised something that history still struggles to discuss openly. According to the Chronicle of Geoffrey Le Baker, who interviewed the actual executioners years later, they chose the most psychologically devastating method imaginable: a red-hot iron poker inserted through his rectum. But here's what nobody tells you about this execution. It wasn't just about killing Edward. It was about destroying his manhood, his dignity, everything that made him king. Medieval society viewed this particular form of violation as the ultimate humiliation for any man, let alone a monarch. Imagine you're Edward in that moment. You've ruled England for 20 years, commanded armies, lived in Westminster Palace, and now you're held down by common soldiers while they prepare the most intimate torture device ever conceived. The executioners heated the poker until it glowed white-hot. Baker's Chronicle describes how they used a horn funnel to direct the weapon precisely, ensuring maximum internal damage while leaving no external evidence. The psychological torture was as deliberate as the physical. They wanted Edward to know exactly what was coming. Contemporary accounts suggest the screaming could be heard throughout the castle. Servants reported that Edward's cries lasted for nearly an hour before he finally succumbed. The poker burned through his internal organs, causing massive hemorrhaging. But from the outside, he simply appeared to have died in his sleep. Here's the most twisted detail. They chose this method specifically because Edward was rumored to have had male lovers. His executioners turned his alleged private life into his public death sentence. It wasn't just murder. It was a statement about sexual power, royal authority, and masculine dominance. When morning came, Isabella announced that her husband had died peacefully of natural causes. The official story: a sudden illness. No investigation, no questions. The perfect crime. Except for one thing. The executioners kept talking. Years later, their confessions revealed the truth. But by then, Isabella and Mortimer were untouchable. Edward's death had served its purpose. It proved that even kings could be reduced to screaming, helpless victims. Don't click away, because the next emperor's death makes this look merciful. What happened to Emperor Jing of Liang involved his own family watching him suffer for 3 hours straight. You think a red-hot poker was brutal? Wait until you see what Chinese executioners did when they had unlimited time and creativity. March 15th, 549 A.D., Jiangkang, China. Emperor Jing of Liang kneels before a massive bronze cauldron filled with boiling water. But this isn't some ceremonial ritual. His own nephew, Emperor Wu, has just sentenced him to the most drawn-out execution in imperial Chinese history. But here's what makes this absolutely horrifying. They kept him conscious for the entire 3-hour ordeal. According to official records from the Book of Liang Dynasty, Emperor Jing had committed the ultimate imperial crime. He tried to poison his nephew during a family feast. When the plot was discovered, Wu decided that Jing's death should match the betrayal: slow, intimate, and witnessed by the entire royal family. Picture the scene. The court assembles in the main palace hall. A massive cauldron sits in the center.
steam rising from the bubbling water. Emperor Jing, still wearing his silk robes, is forced to watch as servants gradually increase the temperature. But here's what makes this absolutely psychologically brutal. They didn't throw him in all at once. The executioners followed a precise ritual designed to maximize suffering while maintaining consciousness. First, they stripped Jing naked in front of his own children and grandchildren. Then, they lowered him feet first into the water, stopping at his ankles. Historical accounts describe how he screamed and begged, but Wu sat on his throne, calmly eating fruit and watching his uncle cook alive. Every 10 minutes, they lowered Jing deeper, ankles, then calves, then knees. The Chinese court physicians had calculated exactly how much heat the human body could endure while remaining conscious. They wanted Jing awake for every single moment.
Contemporary witnesses reported that Jing's skin began peeling off in strips around the 1-hour mark. But the most disturbing detail? His own son stood guard to ensure he couldn't escape. Family loyalty meant nothing when imperial authority was at stake. By hour 2, the water had reached Jing's waist. Court records describe how he alternated between screaming for mercy and cursing his nephew's name. The assembled nobles were forced to watch. This wasn't just an execution. It was a lesson about the price of betrayal. But the most twisted part? His own son watched and did nothing. In fact, when Jing finally lost consciousness after 2 hours and 47 minutes, his son was the one who confirmed his death to Emperor Wu. The family that had once ruled together now watched one of their own become literal soup. But what we've seen so far is nothing compared to the psychological techniques that broke these rulers before they even died. I know this is getting dark, but if you're still watching, you're clearly as fascinated by history's brutal truths as I am, because the real horror wasn't just how they died. Here's what history books will never tell you. These weren't just executions. They were psychological warfare campaigns designed to destroy not just the king, but the entire concept of royal divinity. See, every single one of these execution methods followed the same terrifying pattern. First, strip away the symbols of power, the crown, the robes, the titles. Force the king to become just another naked, terrified human being. Then attack the most private, vulnerable parts of their identity. Make them beg, make them scream. Most importantly, make sure everyone watches. But here's the most disturbing part. The executioners studied their victims' psychology for months before striking. They knew Maximinus's greatest fear was being seen as weak by his soldiers, so they made sure his army watched him run naked from lions. They knew Edward's rumored relationships with men, so they chose a method that specifically targeted and violated his sexuality. They knew Emperor Jing valued family honor above everything, so they forced his own relatives to witness his slow torture. These weren't crimes of passion. They were calculated campaigns to prove that divine right was just an elaborate lie. Every scream, every plea for mercy, every moment of helpless terror was designed to echo through history itself. And here's the most chilling part. It worked. After Maximinus, Roman emperors began traveling with food tasters and bodyguard rotations. After Edward, English kings never again trusted their wives with political power. After Emperor Jing, Chinese royalty implemented elaborate succession protocols to prevent family betrayals. The executions changed monarchy forever because they revealed the terrifying truth. Underneath all that divine authority was just fragile human flesh, and anyone could break it if they were creative enough. But here's the ultimate irony that will give you chills. Almost every executioner who carried out these brutal deaths eventually met similar fates themselves. The Praetorian guards who fed Maximinus to lions were later executed by the next emperor for treason. Isabella and Mortimer, who ordered Edward's poker execution, were eventually captured and tortured to death by Edward's son. Emperor Wu, who boiled his uncle alive,
was assassinated by his own nephew just 3 years later using poison, the same method that started the whole cycle. It turns out that once you normalize the complete humiliation of absolute power, that precedent applies to everyone, including you. The most brutal truth about these executions isn't how they killed these kings. It's how they revealed that ultimate power and ultimate vulnerability are separated by nothing more than circumstance and timing. Every tyrant, every dictator, every person who thinks they're untouchable needs to remember, somewhere out there is someone creative enough to prove them very, very wrong. So there you have it, 3 execution methods so brutal that they redefined what it meant to fall from power. Divine right couldn't save these monarchs from very mortal, very public endings. But here's what these deaths reveal about power, revenge, and human nature today. The higher you climb, the further you can fall, and the more creative your enemies become. Every dictator who thinks they're untouchable, every leader who believes their own propaganda about being chosen by God or destiny, they all forget this crucial lesson. Power is just borrowed time, and history has a very long memory for those who abuse it. What these ancient executions teach us isn't just about medieval brutality. It's about the eternal human need to humble those who forget they're human. In our modern world of social media cancel culture and public shaming, we're still doing the same thing, just with different tools. Which execution shocked you the most? Was it the emperor fed to lions, the king tortured with a red-hot poker, or the ruler boiled alive by his own family? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'm revealing the most brutal torture methods used on medieval queens. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.